Public Relations. Edward L. Bernays. 1945. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Part 2. Public Relations in Action. 26. Public Relations for Public Education. Society and civilization are possible only because man can think and communicate thought and because he transmits knowledge to his children. No society could possibly exist without some kind of educational system for training the next generation. It is education that gives continuity to communities, nations, and civilizations. One of the obstacles that our educational system faces is in the field of public relations. We cannot have better education until there is better public understanding of our schools. This was the theme of a talk I delivered before 500 educators and public leaders who attended the second annual Conference of School Administrators and Supervisors in April, 1949. This theme is developed in this chapter, which deals with the engineering of the public's consent for a broader and more realistic treatment of our educational system. It will help us to master the present acute crisis in public education if we recall the basic role that education plays in the ideal of American democracy. That role was clearly defined by the founding fathers of this republic. Thomas Jefferson said in 1787, "Do not be too severe upon the errors of the people, but reclaim them by enlightening them." Later he added, "Educate and inform the whole mass of people. They are the only reliance for the preservation of liberty." James Madison added to this idea when he said, "A popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both." And Abraham Lincoln carried the thought still further when he declared, "I view education as the most important subject we, as a people, can be engaged in." These utterances embody the essence of our democracy. Our country was founded and built up in the conviction that democracy is possible only when we have an educated body of citizens. This is so clear that the educational objectives formulated by Jefferson, Madison, and Lincoln are what the enemies of democracy attack first. They are what we must, above all, preserve. To what extent have these objectives been met, and what is the state of public understanding and action regarding them? In this chapter I shall discuss 1. The activities aimed at furthering better public understanding of our public schools, 2. Statistics on the status and needs of the public schools, 3. The acuteness of the current crisis in education, 4. The origin and extent of the current lack of understanding of the educational crisis as revealed by public opinion surveys, 5. Recommendations for engineering the consent of the public to a deeper, broader, more realistic treatment of public school education. Efforts to develop public understanding of education cannot be considered abstractly. Any public relations campaign in this direction must be based on a clear conception of the goal to be attained. Our goal is the development of public recognition of and support for the idea that public education is the job of the American people as a whole. Public education is one function of government. The public school is the basic force in maintaining and advancing our democracy. It welds together the constituent groups of our society at the most impressionable time of the individual's life. It carries forward through the individual our culture and our ideals: freedom, equality, and orderly justice. And in the modern situation of increasing social rigidity, the public school serves as a leavening agent. It is in the public school that the American citizen is formed. Today, more than ever before, we see how right Jefferson, Madison, and Lincoln were in basing popular government on the education of the people. In this turbulent, fateful 20th century, the national and international decisions the American people make must be made with a knowledge and understanding of the facts. If our people are badly educated, or not educated at all, they are bound to become the victims of pressure and propaganda groups. Unless we have the kind of popular education required by modern conditions, we cannot make the kind of decisions demanded of free men in a democracy like ours. To what extent do we actually have the necessary popular education? And what effect has our existing education had upon vital national decisions? In his recent book The Man in the Street, Professor T.A. Bailey ascribes our confused policies in foreign affairs to the average American's lack of education. He points out that 6 out of every 10 Americans never go beyond the 8th grade of public school. And the greater ranks below high school and college groups in purely factual information. On almost every item of a questionnaire in which respondents were classified by education, the lowest educational bracket appeared as the most narrow, short-sighted, and unenlightened. Most of the don't know, no opinion, and undecided replies were concentrated in this group, an unpredictable, explosive segment of the population. Significantly, the opinions of graders were far less liberal than those of high school and college groups. These are vastly meaningful revelations. Public education is of the utmost importance to every part of our national being. Full support of our public schools by the public is indispensable for our survival in a world of conflicting ideologies. The current crisis in education is not simply one more crisis. It is a gigantic problem that must be solved through public understanding if our nation is to live. What are the specific inadequacies of our present-day school system that must be overcome? Not long ago, the New York Times listed the following educational needs: 1. Greater financial support. 2. Greater school allocations by communities, states, and the federal government for increasing teachers' salaries. 3. Equal pay for elementary and high school teachers. 4. Improvement and increase of urban and rural school buildings. 5. Improvement of teacher training through modern methods. School teachers must have greater influence on school administration, professional standards must be raised, and there must be better recruitment of teachers, better tenure rules, and better retirement laws. In order to achieve these goals, the public must be made to understand what our schools mean to the life of the nation, what they are doing, how they operate, and what their place is in the life of the community and of the individual. It might be assumed that the public is already profoundly interested in education. Isn't it obvious that nothing can be more important than the training of our children? Unfortunately, the public does not feel that way at all. Here are some figures that show where education stands in America today. In 1948, the American people spent $8,800,000,000 for liquor. We spent $4,147,000,000 for tobacco. But in the same year we spent only $4,053,000,000 for education, only 1.7% of our national income, a considerable drop from the Depression year 1932, when we spent more than 5% of our national income on education. Even this is in striking contrast to Russia, which spends 8% of its national income on schools. The picture is even darker when we consider what some of our states spend on education. In 1948, Mississippi spent only $71.62 for each pupil. Colorado spent $188.18 a year per pupil, and New York $256.08. The situation is appalling when we consider the number of pupils involved in our limited educational budgets. In 1948 there were 23,945,000 pupils in the public schools of the United States. Of these, 18,291,227 were in kindergartens and elementary schools and 4,745,000 in secondary schools. In 1948 all publicly controlled schools were valued at only $9,200,000,000. What about the men and women who teach these 23,945,000 children? The number of teachers in 1947-48 was only 907,000. And though the task forced upon these teachers is colossal, they are grossly underpaid. In Mississippi, the average salary of public school teachers in 1948 was only $1,256 a year. The national mean for teachers' salaries was as low as $2,639 in that same year. These annual earnings are not likely to attract the kind of men and women desperately needed by the teaching profession. Furthermore, our school buildings are far from adequate. Millions of American children attend classes in obsolete buildings that are potential fire traps. Recently, Benjamin Fine, education editor of the New York Times, reported that American public schools need $10 billion merely for buildings. His survey revealed a deplorable obsolescence of school buildings that can be overcome only by a 10-year building program in which the states would receive federal aid. The crisis in education thus comes down in part to a lack of teachers and lack of proper school buildings. To overcome these handicaps, there must be a greater gross expenditure for education. Unless the necessary steps are taken now, the crisis is bound to deepen. The Bureau of the Census estimates that by April 1960, there will be an increase of 42% in the number of pupils attending private and public elementary schools, and an increase of 20% in the number of high school pupils. Beginning in 1952-53, the school system as a whole must be prepared to absorb more than 1 million new pupils each year for 3 years. This means that the school system will need about 25,000 additional teachers each year. The federal government is aware of this crisis. Only recently Emory M. Foster, head of the Reports and Analysis Branch of the Research and Statistical Service of the Federal Security Agency, called attention to it. The public, he said, does not understand the seriousness of the public school situation, not only at the moment but especially in the next 12 years while the successive crop of war babies are being educated. The major problems will be teachers and buildings, and of course increased gross expenditures. All of these problems require long-term planning. Moreover, we are apparently powerless to remedy the situation except to cry a warning from the housetops and hope that something may happen. Our traditions are all for public school education. But public understanding of its vital importance has not been the dominant force it should be. One reason for this lack of understanding is that the public knows little about the history of American education. We must have a knowledge of the past to build for the future. Education must be considered more fundamentally than as a post-war problem. We must know the basic reasons for the present crisis in education. Our building for the future will be inept and difficult if we fail to understand the interaction of social and historical forces that produce the present. Historical necessity dictated the evolution of our school system. In colonial days there were no public schools. But the groundwork of our system was laid in 1642 when Massachusetts passed a law calling for universal education. 5 years later another law established school districts. Towns of 50 householders were required to provide a teacher, and towns of 100 householders a Latin grammar school. Though the schools thus established were sectarian, the laws were important in setting standards and a ground base for compulsory support of schools by the community. There was no such movement in the southern colonies. Here the 18th century English system prevailed. The children of the well-to-do had private tutors, poor children were sent to pauper, apprenticeship, church, and charity schools. The origins of our present educational system will be better understood when we realize that our federal constitution does not mention public schools and that none of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were public school graduates. Furthermore, although the Constitution provides for the separation of church and state in government, there was no separation of church and state education until the 19th century. And it was not till 1802 that Ohio made the first public land grant in America for school use. But the First Amendment to the Constitution had its effect on education. It provides that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion and was intended to exclude the struggle of sects from government. It soon became evident that sectarian struggle ought to be excluded from education. New generations of Americans could be trained for common American goals and purposes only if all the people of the state controlled the schools through their state government. Like all new ideas, that of universal, secular, state-controlled education had to fight its way to victory. The struggle for and against state-controlled school raged from 1820 to 1860. This battle was waged against a background of rising cities and industries, the growth of modern transportation and communication, the extension of the right to vote, and the development of workers' education. The champions of the public school were democratic leaders, philanthropists, humanitarians, urban residents, people who did not pay taxes, industrial workers, and educational groups. Opponents were the rich, the rural residents, taxpayers, leaders of religious sects, private school owners. Opposition was particularly strong in the South. In the 1850s the public school began to emerge victorious. By this time many influential people recognized the necessity for state-supported public schools and the right of the state to tax for school purposes. In 1852 Massachusetts passed the first law requiring compulsory public school education. The law made mandatory 12 weeks schooling per year for children 8 to 14 years of age. By 1889 25 states had passed similar laws. Mississippi did not pass a law establishing compulsory education until 1920. These laws, however, did not necessarily alter public attitudes toward education. Nor were the laws strictly enforced anywhere except in Massachusetts and Connecticut. Many states vitiated the school law by providing that pupils might attend school a minimum number of weeks instead of the full school term. The school system was further weakened by the inadequacy of laws against child labor. The backwardness of public attitudes toward universal education is indicated by the fact that it was not until 1867 that the first United States Commissioner of Education was appointed. It is only in the past 50 years that as a nation we have realized the broad purposes and the vital importance of the public school for America's welfare, and it is only the most alert Americans who have understood the public school as a great social force. Why has public understanding of education developed so slowly? E. G. Turner suggests some of the reasons in his classic study, The Passing of the Frontier. The pioneers were too much absorbed in the heroic business of clearing a continent to pay much attention to schools. Certainly the fur trader and Indian fighter had little opportunity, time, or need to think about the importance of education. Public education began to come into its own only when the more substantial farmers made improvements on the land, when men of capital and enterprise created industries and cities, and when banks established the nation's financial structure. But our pioneer background is not far behind us. Its indifference to formal education still lingers in our thought pattern. The public today still fails to understand the importance of education. Public opinion polls on education sustain this observation. In 1947 the American Institute of Public Opinion took a poll on the question, "What do you think is the most important problem today?" Not a single reply said education. That same year, the National Opinion Research Center made a survey based on the question, when you think of the problems facing the United States, which one comes to your mind first? Only 6% of the people interviewed listed general social problems such as education, health, and social maladjustment. In July 1947, a poll was taken on the question, would you like to attend classes and take special courses for adults in some school or college? Of those interviewed, 59% said no or I don't know, and only 41% said yes. These responses reflect public attitudes in regard to education. The chances are that people who do not want education for themselves will not care about the national crisis in education. The ignorance and apathy of most Americans regarding education is also reflected in prevailing notions about teachers' salaries. In 1946, the National Education Association made a survey of public opinion on this subject. Of those interviewed, 33% said teachers' salaries are about right, 2% said the salaries are too high, and 21% had no opinion. Similarly, a Gallup poll taken in September 1946 showed that 87% of the people questioned were satisfied with the school their children attended, while only 12% were dissatisfied. In May of that year, there was another Gallup poll based on the question, do you think there are any states which do not provide a satisfactory education? 20% of those questioned said no, 29% were undecided, and 51% said yes. In 1943, a National Opinion Research Center survey showed that 29% of the people questioned believed that all American public schools had as much money as they needed to do a good job of education, 17% were undecided, and 54% said our schools did not have enough money. A survey made by the same organization the following year further emphasized the public's lack of understanding regarding education and its vital importance for our national survival. Questioned on what children ought to be taught, 34% of those interviewed said the most important thing for children is a mastery of the 3 R's. Public understanding had not improved by 1948, though we had only recently emerged from the biggest war in history, a war in which an understanding by the people of the basic issues played a key role. A Gallup poll taken that year revealed that the most common complaints about our educational system were not about the factors endangering our school system at its very foundations. Only a minority of those questioned spoke of inadequate and overcrowded school buildings, and the shortage and underpayment of teachers. Most interviewees criticized such factors as lack of discipline and character training, the curriculum, teaching methods, lack of interest in education on the part of the parents, and the excessive extracurricular activities. In August 1950, Elmo Roper conducted a nationwide survey for Life magazine, the results of which were published in Life's special issue on United States schools on October 16, 1950. This poll showed that the attitude of the people was generally the same as that shown in the polls made in 1946, 1947, and 1948. One of the questions asked was, taking everything into consideration, would you say you are very satisfied, only fairly well satisfied, or not very satisfied with the public school system in your community? The replies showed that 33.4% were very satisfied and 38.2% were fairly well satisfied. Only 16.8% were not satisfied. The others didn't answer or didn't know. Asked whether they thought teachers in their communities were underpaid, overpaid, or paid the amount they should receive, 43.9% said underpaid, 1.7% said overpaid, 34.1% said they thought teachers received the right amount, and 20.3% didn't know or didn't answer. The following question, however, shows how confused the situation is, for the public, in spite of its apathy, had some awareness of the importance of education. Asked to rank the order of importance to the community of public school teachers, clergymen, public officials, merchants, and lawyers, 31.3% thought teachers were most important, 27.1% clergymen, 19.1% public officials, 12.8% merchants, and 9.7% lawyers. How can public understanding of education be developed so that the public will both know the facts and act upon them? Knowledge of the facts alone does not necessarily lead to desired action. The facts about the crisis in education must be integrated with realizable social goals, and they must be acted upon if the crisis is to be resolved. To achieve the necessary action, the consent of the public must be engineered in the desired direction. In a world where thousands of facts compete daily for our attention, we must so focus public attention on the educational crisis as to bring about social change in favor of a better educational system. In our society, 3 forces work together to bring about social change: 1. Public opinion, 2. The activity of voluntary groups, and 3. The law. Enforceable law depends upon a public opinion which demands that law and is willing to obey it. As has been pointed out in other connections in this book, public opinion often is not well enough informed to constitute the dynamic force it can be. To inform public opinion about a given issue, it is necessary to endow that issue with high visibility. Public education has a particularly low visibility, and so requires even greater effort in making the public aware of what is involved and what must be done in the current educational crisis. It is only when public opinion is thoroughly informed, aroused, and ready to act that we shall get the laws necessary to lift our school system from its present slough of despond. What we need today are voluntary groups that will educate the public about education and so create the necessary public demand for laws that will save and improve our school system. These voluntary groups should consist not only of men and women professionally engaged in education, but also of community leaders who are earnestly interested in it and are willing to do something about it. Once these two groups inform the public about the importance and the problems of our school system, the public will demand and back laws to safeguard and advance that system. This is the general line along which we can fight for better education, more and better school buildings, more and better paid teachers. To be sure, it would not be simple and easy. There is as much competition in serving the nation as there is in politics or business, and the educational field has its own conflicting views and egos. But these obstacles confront every attempt to improve something, and they can be overcome. The important thing is for groups of educators and laymen to work unremittingly for an informed public opinion that will demand action to solve the crisis. The best results will be achieved if lay and professional groups carry on their educational campaign with the most complete cooperation and in a centralized way. Professional and lay groups will have to work at every level of education from kindergarten to college and at every level of geographic distribution: national, state, community, and neighborhood. For this complex work to be effective, it must be democratically coordinated. Since free competition of ideas in the marketplace is basic to our democracy, many groups have found that a unified front is essential if they are to be heard above the competitive din. Intelligent, coordinated planning, even on a minimum of points agreed upon, produces quicker, more effective results. The areas of agreement among the groups engaged in this campaign should be as broad as possible and should create a unified front that could attack the problem vigorously and effectively. Of course, a unified front does not necessarily mean a single national organization of all the groups interested in more and better public schools. Such an organization would be ideal, but difficult to achieve. It would be easier for public school educators and civic-minded citizens to work out a unified front within their state, city, community, or neighborhood. Such a unified front would be the first vital step in creating the necessary public understanding of the problems and actions involved. The men and women connected with public school education are already organized on many levels. They have national, regional, state, and local associations, professional and lay. Teachers have guilds and unions of various complexions. And the lay groups are diversified too, ranging from parent-teacher associations to do-good societies of various degrees of effectiveness. All these groups have their value. Their existence assures a higher visibility for educational needs than would exist without them. Nevertheless, the multiplicity of voices crying out on behalf of education sounds more like a meaningless babel than a concerted effort to speed up the social change that is imperative if our schools are to be improved. The inadequacies, the necessities and realities of the situation remain. It is imperative that all the groups working for better education speak with one voice, each group at the same time retaining its own freedom and responsibility to work on its own level. Such a unification of effort would minimize the duplication and distortion that are bound to confuse, instead of enlightening, the public. Our generation has experienced the supreme test of the effectiveness of democratic centralization of effort. In both world wars, the Allies found that only the appointment of a supreme commander of all the armies could speed up and assure final victory. So, too, the USO, the National War Fund, and other great voluntary wartime organizations found this principle extremely effective. The field of education requires a similar approach today. We would go a long way toward solving the crisis in education if we set up a central board of strategy that would set policy and goals at all levels. Once there is agreement on common goals, and a coordination of group effort, there will still remain certain basic factors necessary for developing public understanding of education. Every group involved in the campaign must be clear about its objectives. Through thorough research, an accurate inventory of our schools must be made, to give us a complete picture of what is needed in physical equipment and teaching personnel. We must also do the research necessary to get an accurate picture of public attitudes toward public school education. Here we must find out specifically why the public does not grasp the significance of the broader developments of educational theory and practice, what the potentials of the public are for overcoming this deficiency, and how it can be rectified. This research must answer a number of key questions. What are the areas of distortion, apathy, misunderstanding, and ignorance about public school education and its functions in a democracy? Who and where are the enemies, hidden and overt, of public school education, and what are they saying and doing against it? In the light of limitations in time, manpower and mechanics, what shall be our objectives in reorienting the public? What organizations, plans, and tactics should be utilized in this campaign of educating the public about education? Research can do more than find out what the public thinks. It can and must also find out what is wrong with the objectives and activities of an institution, what has caused ill will, misunderstanding, or indifference toward public school education, what necessary things have been left undone, what gains and losses have been made by the public school system. Another thing that we must establish by research is the aggregate of publics we must take into consideration, how these publics function and why. In this case, the publics we have to deal with include the Board of Education, the parents and relatives of school children, and taxpayers who have no direct relation to the school system. In the light of such fundamental research, the objectives of the campaign may have to be reoriented. The next step is a clear-cut plan of operational organization. An effective campaign to improve our schools requires hard work. This means manpower, money, time, and organization. It is the organization that must decide upon the themes, the strategy, and the tactics of the campaign to bring about better public understanding of education. Strategy and tactics concentrate on bringing about high visibility for the crisis in education. Specific actions must be initiated to engineer public consent in relation to this issue. Appeals must be geared to every motivation of the individuals and groups involved, and must employ factual evidence, emotion, reason and tradition. The activities of the campaign must be continuous, in order that as many as possible may come to identify themselves with the issue. And it must be remembered all along the line that planned events are more powerful than words. The activities of the campaign must be both informational and organizational. They should include efforts to secure well-rounded cooperation of schools with the community. This will go a long way toward bringing about a better public understanding of the problem. There are many things a school can do in this direction. School buildings can be offered for public meetings, for adult education, for consumer training, and for recreational purposes. Above all, schools can run open forums where they can explain themselves to the community. Apart from this direct use of the school in our educational campaign, schools can also influence the public through such media as the newspapers, the radio, television, posters, pamphlets, and motion pictures. These are very effective ways of focusing the public's attention on an issue. Another important tactic is a more effective cooperation between schools and parents. Perhaps personal letters would do more good than report cards. Schools might have more visiting days, and more teacher-parent meetings, which would strengthen the identification of the community with the school. In addition to specific relationships between the school and the community, a great deal would be gained if teachers would cooperate directly with the community. Teachers can assume leadership in the social services and other community activities. They can also be spokesmen for education in chambers of commerce, American Legion posts, service clubs, and similar civic groups. Through personal contact with individuals and groups, they can encourage discussion of vital educational issues. By activities of this kind, they can greatly increase the public's understanding of public education. As for the professional organizations of men and women in the school system, their activities ought to have two main objectives. They can cooperate with lay organizations in carrying out well-integrated programs designed to educate the public and to obtain laws that will further the interests of the school system. And they can increase understanding by their own membership of the issues involved in the current educational crisis. Only coordinated effort will help us overcome the present chaos in our educational system. And we must act quickly, for that chaos is very dangerous to our children and to our future, a deadly menace to the generations to come, the level of whose intelligence and character will determine the character of the America of the future.